Hi everyone, in this video we are going to be talking about biodiversity. And the first thing that we'll get into is what exactly is biodiversity? The word biodiversity is a shortening of the phrase biological diversity. And in general, we can think of it just sort of referring to the variety of life. It's estimated that there are about 8.7 million species living on this planet, and of those 8.7 million, we've only been able to identify and describe about 1.2 million. So there's a lot of different kinds of living things out there waiting to be discovered. So when we're thinking about biodiversity, there are a few different levels that we can consider. So, at the sort of finest level of detail, we have what's called genetic diversity. And this refers to the variation of genes within one species. So one example, you can see here corn. Corn has a lot of genetic diversity, and you can see that reflected in the different size and color of corn that exists out there. And genetic diversity is also going to be really important because it's this variation that allows natural selection to work on a population. So genetic diversity is variation within the gene pool for a species. The next level is species diversity. And this is, I think, the most intuitive kind of diversity that most people think of when they hear the word biodiversity. Species diversity refers to the different species of plants, animals, and microorganisms within a region. So for species diversity, we're looking at a particular area, and you can measure how many different kinds of organisms are in that place. And then finally, we also have ecosystem diversity. And this refers to the variety of habitat types and organisms that occupy them within a region. And this is a little harder to measure because there's usually not a distinct boundary between one habitat type and the next. But it's just referring to the kinds of places that organisms are able to live in. Okay, so now we have a little bit of a better grasp on what biodiversity is. And next, we're going to talk about why biodiversity matters. Why is it important? There are a lot of different sort of aspects to why we might value biodiversity. Some of them are more utilitarian and some are less so. But first, we could think about ecological value. So, when we were talking about photosynthesis, we said that every species on the planet ultimately lies on producers for food. They either might rely on producers directly because they eat them, or they might eat organisms that eat producers, secondary and tertiary consumers. So this was getting at this ecological value. All species are supported by interactions with other species. So this could be producers. We could also think of the role in decomposers for cycling nutrients, pollinators, or other organisms that maybe spread seeds around, for example. So ecological value is the importance species have in relation to one another. We can also think of economic value, and this is getting at the idea that we as humans rely on wild species for products and services. So this could be raw materials. So thinking of getting, materials like wood and rubber and cotton from wild species. Also more commercial kinds of industries. So fishing, logging, and those sorts of things. We get a lot of medicine and spices from plants and animals, and then also tourism. And then we also can think of cultural value. So, human culture is often attached to wild species, and this could be in a religious sense or a spiritual sense. Also, just in the sense of aesthetics and appreciating nature, or thinking about the value of nature for mental and physical health. And then finally, this is a little bit more of a philosophical idea, but the idea of inherent value is saying that an organism possesses value in its own right. So it's not dependent on how useful that organism is or what we can get from it, just that in and of itself, it has value. Okay, so this last slide is talking about threats to biodiversity. So the first one that's listed here is habitat destruction and fragmentation. So this is when a particular habitat that organisms are living in, when that habitat's no longer able to support the life of the organisms that are there. So it's going to decline their population. And this can be caused by natural events, so something like a hurricane or a forest fire, but it can also be caused by human activities. So when we um, do things like deforestation, or if we turn marshland into places to build buildings in, then that would contribute to habitat destruction and fragmentation as well. The next one listed here is climate change, and that's referring to the long-term change in the Earth's climate, where we're getting increasing temperatures, more acidic oceans. So obviously, organisms that live in colder and more glacial environments, organisms that are in the water, organisms that live in the shores are at risk due to rising sea levels, things like that. The next one here is pollution. And this could be pollution of the air, pollution of water, and different species will be vulnerable to pollution in different kinds of ways. But one source of this pollution comes from burning fossil fuels. So this releases pollutants into the air and then it can fall to the ground and contribute to acid rain. Even if organisms aren't directly exposed to the pollution themselves, uh, if they eat organisms that have these pollutants in them, then those pollutants can accumulate in the bodies of these higher level consumers. The fourth one listed here is invasive species. So this is when an organism is introduced into a foreign habitat, and usually when this happens, the species that evolved with that organism are not in that habitat, and this allows the invasive species to outcompete the native species. So when an invasive species comes to dominate an area, then the native species can be displaced or or completely disappear from that area. And then finally, the last one we have listed here is overexploitation. Overexploitation. And this is when we overharvest species and natural resources faster than they can sustain themselves in the wild. And that puts the whole species population at risk. So things like overharvesting and overfishing is a big one. An example is tuna and cod. Both of those are overfished, and when you reduce a species through overexploitation, it's going to affect the whole food web of whatever ecosystem it's in. So these are the main threats to biodiversity, and obviously human impacts are a big piece here. So by changing to more sustainable managing of our wildlife situation, we can reduce these threats. Okay, so this was the biodiversity video, and I'll see you all later.